Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Campus Consortium's EdTalk featuring Lance Kennedy-Phillips from Penn State University. Today's topic for EdTalks is Culture for Institutional Effectiveness, Creating and Sustaining the Innovative Wheel. Our presenter today is Lance Kennedy-Phillips, who's the Vice Provost for Planning and Assessment from Penn State University. And our EdTalk facilitator today is John Wanamaker, who's the Executive Director of Campus Consortium. We will take the questions at the end of today's presentation that have been typed into the chat box or questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. Now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce and present to you Mr. Wanamaker and Mr. Phillips. Over to you, John.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to all of you for joining us today for what I'm sure will be an engaging and informative session on the increasingly important topic of forming a culture of assessment in higher ed institutions that can be highly sustainable and fruitful. We'd like to also thank our sponsors of today's EdTalk, as their sponsorship makes it possible for the Campus Consortium to deliver grant awards that help drive innovation at K-12 and higher ed institutions across the globe. It is the mission of the consortium to help members reduce the time, costs, and effort associated with implementing enterprise IT services by leveraging shared IT services, lessons learned, and best practices. I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Lance Kennedy-Phillips. Lance is currently the Vice Provost for Planning and Assessment at Penn State University. Lance, earlier as the Associate Vice Provost for Institutional Research at the University of Illinois, collaborated with college deans and administrative units to maximize the use of data in strategic planning, program review, outcomes assessment, and accreditation. He has conducted institutional studies of factors that influence and enhance student success. Kennedy-Phillips' other experiences include serving as Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Student Life at Ohio State. He was the Associate Director of Institutional Planning and Research, and he has research at the University of Florida and as a research associate in institutional research and planning at DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Eastern Illinois and has a Master's of Education and a Doctorate in Higher Education Administration from the University of Nebraska. It is my pleasure to introduce you all today to Lance Kennedy-Phillips of Penn State University. Lance, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm glad to be here. And thank you, John, and to the members of the Campus Consortium for what's actually my second invitation. Glad to be back. Really enjoy speaking with the group. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Chris Jacob, how do I need to share my screen now to share the PowerPoint?
Whenever you're ready, Lance, if you want, I can pass you the presenter control and you can take it from there.
That would be great. I'm ready when I'm ready.
You're ready? Let me pass you the presenter control.
Yep.
There you go.
Thank you to John and the Campus Consortium group for inviting me to come back again to speak. And thank you to all the participants out there. I know it's April and late April, and you're getting close to the end of your term, and so to take some time out to listen to me and have some dialogue about institutional effectiveness, I do appreciate it. And so thank you very much. And as John said and Chris said also, I'm looking forward to the questions that you have about this topic. I always like to say when we speak about these things, we're actively engaged in it. This is the work that I do every day, but I love to learn and hear about things that are happening in your areas and on your campuses as well. So I look forward to our dialogue a little bit later. You know, you can take institutional effectiveness in so many different ways, and as we think about it here, I always like to say our Office of Planning and Assessment, which I oversee, is really an Office of Institutional Effectiveness. And in many ways, you can look at institutional effectiveness, and I think many people do from a data and an evidence perspective. I think that's very important. You can look at IE, which I'll keep calling it for the rest of this presentation, from a strategic planning perspective. You can look at IE from not only from a strategic plan, but also from a student success perspective. There are a lot of different ways we look at institutional effectiveness. My CFO would say he looks at it from more of a finance perspective. I know as part of our office, I'm the accreditation officer for the university, so I also look at institutional effectiveness from an accreditation lens. But today I'm going to focus this talk on institutional effectiveness from a perspective of strategic planning. And so what's our roadmap? Where are we headed today, and what are some of the topics we're going to talk about? First, I'm going to start us with just a really brief overview of higher education, where we are now, and what the future looks like for me and what I think it looks like for higher ed in the next 10 to 20 years. I'd like to talk about the tenets of institutional effectiveness, and we have 4 areas in our office that we follow when we think about the field of IE and institutional effectiveness. I want to share those with you. And then I want to focus that discussion into institutional effectiveness in action here, which for us is our strategic planning process. Finally, at the end of the day, I want to tie it all together. I have what I call McLaughlanisms. You heard from John that I worked at DePaul University for a few years, and I worked on the Jerry McLaughlin. And over the years, I picked up a few what I call McLaughlanisms that I'll share with you later on. Just some pearls of wisdom from someone who has been active in this field. So on the next slide, we have a poll. Can we go to the next? Thank you. So one thing I like to do is just gauge the audience, just to get a sense of where you are when it comes to your attitudes towards institutional effectiveness. And so you'll see here, I have 4 photos, and the photos for me are pretty interesting because photo A is saying, you know, what's your attitude when you think about, are you new to this world? Are you kind of like that flower that's just developing? Or are you like B or C for me, overwhelmed and excited always about institutional effectiveness and where you're at with it? Or are you that last photo that's on this slide where we think about, are you a little skeptical of institutional effectiveness in this term that's supposed to be all-encompassing when it comes to how we perform as a higher ed institution? So take a minute, let me know if you're new to this work, excited about this work, or a little skeptical. There we go. So a lot of people are new to this work. About 30% of you are new to it. That's great. I hope to give you a little bit of a foundation and some things to think about as you move forward. For those of you that are excited and engaged in this work on a regular basis, I hope to hear some of your ideas and share some and learn some of the good things that you're doing. I hope that, again, I can give you a few pearls of wisdom and that we've learned here at Penn State. And then finally, for my skeptics, I hear you. I would actually probably put my boss in that skeptic box sometimes, but I think we're bringing him around, so I hope I bring all of you around too, at least to start thinking about it from a perspective of how do we engage in those tenets of institutional effectiveness, even if we don't call it institutional effectiveness. So thank you very much for taking a moment to do that. Let's go ahead and back to the slides, Chris. I appreciate it. So one thing I like to do is take a moment to kind of see where we at, and you know, what are some of the challenges for higher education. And I still this slide from my CIO. He likes to use it to talk about Penn State's technology systems, but I think it is very relevant, even talking about some of the challenges that we face in higher education. What's visible? We know the things that are visible to the world when it comes to American higher education, student loan debt, the free speech debate that's taking place right now, and most recently, the admissions crisis or scandals that's happening at some of our elite institutions. There's a lot of things that's happening right now. Even when we think about hazing in our fraternities and sororities, that's still an ongoing issue, at least here at Penn State. And then there's some skepticism of the value of higher education lately. We're hearing that from various sectors of our country, and probably internationally as well, that there is some skepticism when it comes to, is this degree worth the cost? And that's visible. Now, what I like to say is, a lot of the things that I just mentioned are a result of what's underneath the surface and some of the challenges that face us as higher education, particularly things like our financial struggles. We still work with aging systems while we're trying to be aggressive in technology and the use of data, we're still doing that through aging systems. We have a complexity. Higher education is extremely complex. I just recently ran a study where Penn State has an $11.6 billion economic impact on the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And when we ran that study, we looked at the various reaches this institution has. It's very vast and it's very complex. So when you think about the complexity of of our institutions, we also think a lot about how sometimes we are slow to innovate. And I think it does feed into many of the challenges that we have in higher education. But as I move forward, let's do a forward look. I think if you look at American higher education 20 to 30 years from now, there are probably 3 to 4 things I think are going to be very key to our success in American higher education. First, the changing demographics. You see it listed as a challenge, but it's also going to be an opportunity for American higher education. Not only our student bodies are changing, and they're changing currently, but our staff and our administrators and our faculty, it's all going to look very different in 20 to 30 years, and we have to be prepared for that. And I think that's the challenge, that when you think about American higher education in that time frame, we're going to have to be prepared for that. And I think a true model of institutional effectiveness is preparing you to do that. The other thing is the resource question. We are still struggling with resources, and it's going to get even worse over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. You've seen it. You've seen that bar graph where they have the rising tuition rates and the lowering state appropriations or state investment in higher education. It's all over the place. And then we also feel it not only in public education, but we're feeling those squeezes also with our private institutions, particularly those institutions that are dependent on enrollment and tuition dollars to stay afloat. So I think that's going to be another thing for us to be thinking about in the next 20, 30 years, is how do we address these challenges? And the more effective organizations are, the more solid our institutional effectiveness foundation is, the more we'll be prepared to handle that. Another thing I think about right now is an increased emphasis on being more interdisciplinary. We saw me mention earlier about silos. You see up there on the screen where we talk about silos. And really, even from not only from an administrative perspective do we have to work more across the institution, but also our academic disciplines are going to have to figure out how to work better together. Engineering is a great example of how they're connecting the soft skills and those hard engineering skills to be more effective to help engineers be more effective. And I think that's the key to this, is we need to be more interdisciplinary so we can provide our students with the skills they need. Recently, I'm still, one more back for me. Recently we talked about, I heard someone mention the other day about this one line I'm going to give you. I think it's so important that our faculty and our staff need to bring our students where our students need to be in the future, not where our faculty and staff have been. So we have to be prepared to help our students meet the challenges of the future and not feel like they have to do things as we've done them before. Think about that, and think about the discussions we're having currently around data literacy, and we're having these discussions on predictive analytics and learning analytics. And many times I listen to those discussions and I hear, we got to help our students get on the right path. We got to make sure our students know what their options are. And what we should be thinking about is not necessarily do our students need to be on the right path, but sometimes do our systems need to change to meet our students where they are. And I think that's something I think is going to have to be a challenge for American higher education in the future. How do we make our systems adjust to where our students are currently? Okay, now I'll go to the next phase, the next slide. Yeah, we can go, thank you. So to do that, we as an institution have to be more effective. And I look at institutional effectiveness at Penn State, and we kind of follow these 4 tenets as we think about this notion of institutional effectiveness. First is the idea of inquiry. As an institution, we have to be prepared and have the ability to ask the tough questions and to answer them. My provost will say, Lance, I feel like we have trained ourselves over the last 10 to 20 years to not ask tough questions. Meaning, he can ask me what my graduation rate is, and I can tell him pretty easily. He can ask me about our retention rates, and I can tell him pretty easily. But when there's a tougher question of how do we help students graduate in 4 years instead of 6? What are the things the institution can do to ensure we retain more students of color? Those are the tougher questions we need to be able to ask, and that notion of inquiry is so important to being an effective institution. Once we've asked those questions, we have to have the ability to produce evidence to help us answer them. And this is where I think a lot of the institutional effectiveness discussions kind of stay. How do we get better, more robust data so that we can provide evidence to answer these tougher questions? And that's very important. I do believe you cannot have this discussion without talking about evidence. I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the next slide. But once we have the evidence, once we start to answer those questions, we have to have action. And I think that's a key piece of our model here is we have to be able to, through our strategic planning, through our regular day-to-day management, is act on the evidence and act on the data that we're learning. As some of my colleagues may say, how do we act on it, have a data-informed approach to the work that we do? And that's the action that we're looking for. I can't be the Office of Planning and Assessment without mentioning that assessment is key to all of this. I mean, once we've gone through this model of institutional effectiveness, you have to be able to answer this one question: are we doing what we say we're doing? We have to use assessment to measure the outcomes of the institution. And I will argue that assessment is not just quantitative metrics, it's also qualitative data as well. So again, the institutional effectiveness at Penn State, we kind of follow this model of inquiry, which leads to the collection of evidence, which leads to action, and then we do the assessment. Next slide for me, please. Thanks, Chris. As I said before, we can't have this discussion without talking about data and analytics and technology. Right now here at Penn State, we're going through a process of redefining our data ecosystem and through what we call our analytics and business intelligence process at Penn State. We're 2 years into that process, the process of redefining our data ecosystem. I have here a website. I'd love for you to take a look at that. It's psudata.psu.edu. But the foundation of that process is threefold. We think about the people, the process, and the technology. Our CIO would say many institutions look to a technology solution first. Instead, we're taking the approach of how do we make sure the right people have the right data at the right time? And based on that, what processes do we put in place to ensure that those data are appropriate? And then finally, how do we put the technology on top of those processes to make sure they're effective and efficient? So people, process, and technology, these areas working together, I think, are key to having an effective institution. The discussion about data is very important, and I think there are a lot of areas within higher education that are talking about this right now. I think one area I would point to would be the Association for Institutional Research. Leah Ross and Jason Lewis are doing really good work around data-informed decision cultures. And I think that's really a key foundation to institutional effectiveness, is how do we look at those things and how do we look at it from a data-informed perspective. So have an opportunity to check out our website, what we're doing, but also look at some of the national leaders. I'm sure EDUCAUSE has stuff moving in this area, as well as our colleagues at AIR. But if I'm going to bring us back and focus us, I want to focus on an aspect of institutional effectiveness that's very important to me. And if we can go to the next slide, Chris. We focus heavily on planning here, and that's an important aspect of our work, and it's an important aspect of what we do for strategic planning. Our planning process operates on a 5 and actually now a 10-year cycle, and its contributions is from everyone at the university. And one of the key tenets of our institutional effectiveness process and our strategic plan is engagement across the university. We wanted to develop a process and a plan that felt like every level of the university was engaged and involved in it. And I look forward to showing you some of that. What you see here, if you want to get a little bit deeper into our strategic plan, you can go to strategicplan.psu.edu. You can get a chance to look at the work that we're doing. But let me, through the next couple of slides, give you kind of an overview of our planning process. Next slide, please. Thank you. Strategic planning has really paved the way for diversity in many different ways. As Penn State, we're a land grant research institution, and we've been doing strategic planning since the 1980s. We've engaged in strategic planning to strengthen our ability to make careful and informed choices and to allocate resources according to evidence, good judgment, and long-term priorities. And that notion of judgment is so important. You hear the idea of data-informed decision-making, but there's also this notion of judgment and your gut, and we try to bring that into our planning process as well. And while it is nice to be hopeful, and we all are, sitting back and hoping for the best is not a strategy. We simply, we have to make planning matter, and for us, it's been very important. And strategic planning for universities is perhaps more vital now than it's ever been before. You know, you think about the fast-changing world that requires that we break free from static plans, and we've all been there. That strategic plan that basically you go through a 2 or 3 year planning process, you come up with a great spreadsheet with goals and initiatives and a vice president staying by it, and then you set it up on the shelf. For us, plans have to become more agile and more adaptive. We have some rapidly evolving trends in higher education that call for us to be more critical, and we have to be more innovative as we move forward. So we have to have a planning process that's agile. Think about how much, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, how much higher education has changed in the past 20 to 25 years. The culture in higher education is one that has to have innovation, and it requires continuous planning and assessment to ensure that we deliver our students and our key stakeholders what they need when they need it. And we really think a lot about the power of inquiry, where we ask ourselves some key questions like, where will we focus our efforts? What capabilities will we need? How will we succeed? And what will success look like at Penn State and for your institution as well? These are some of the many questions that we try to ask and try to address through our planning process, which is why we think it is so essential to stay engaged in strategic planning. Next slide, please. Next slide, Chris. Thank you. So what does our planning process look like? It's one where I wouldn't say it's innovative. Many times I like to say to folks, we're doing what I think many institutions are doing from some perspectives. We're doing a basic plan, do, check, act approach to strategic planning. Right here, you'll see kind of the model that we follow, where we have a planning, where we did our planning for the first 2 to 3 years. We reaffirmed our vision, we set goals set by our senior leaders, and then that third box there where we talk about our foundations and our thematic priorities and our supporting elements. I'll dig deeper into that in a few minutes, but that was the bulk of our planning. From there, we moved into our implementation phase, and we have a pretty robust and involved implementation process that I want to walk you through. But you know, we did the opportunity scans and we wrote the white papers around all of these key issues. We started to develop action plans to respond to these opportunities, and finally, we're at the point of implementing some of our key initiatives and action plans, not only at the university level but across all of our organizational units as well. One thing that we've realized is that this plan, do, check, act is not necessarily a linear process. So while we're only 3 years into this, we have already begun an assessment and evaluation of our strategic plan. And the purpose of that is to evaluate where we are and revise and make new efforts if necessary. And that's we are actually looking to bring our first evaluation report to the Board of Trustees and to the university community at the end of this month. And it's really going to tell us where adjustments need to be made, where areas are that are very important, and where are some areas that this plan was developed 5 years ago, what's changed since 2014. So it's been a really good model to go through the successful and talk to you about how we focus on alignment and not necessarily on metrics. Next slide, please. Thanks, Chris. So how our plan come together? I mean, again, it was a 2-year effort. Our plan was published in February of 2016. We have 50 plus academic and administrative units that really drove the development of the plan and identified our priorities and goals from 2016 to 2020, which we now in 2025 because the plan was extended. Just to give you a sense of Penn State, if you don't know, we are one university geographically distributed, meaning we actually have 24 campuses across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and we operate under one accreditation for all of our campuses. And so we are one university with 99,000 students across the state of Pennsylvania. And the key there is that we operate under one accreditation. So when we do our strategic plan, it covers every campus that's under the Pennsylvania State University. Next slide, please. Our university-wide plan includes several core components, starting with of course, our vision and our mission statement, and also our institutional values. The key areas, the 3 areas I really want to dive into are, one, our 6 foundations, which are areas we consider integral to all that we do, and sustaining them is the responsibility of every member of the university. So it's not like we're going to have our foundations be their own separate plans, but they should cut across everything we do. Our thematic priorities align with our focus on strengths in growing and teaching, research, and service. These are areas where Penn State is well situated, we believe, to make a significant impact on the Commonwealth and beyond, and that's really important to us. And then finally, we have 3 supporting elements, which I think are more of our inward-facing goals, and these are very important, and our thematic priorities always come up as kind of the sexier. People always want to be more engaged in those, but our supporting elements are the things that if we don't do them well as an organization, we won't be successful. So if you can click to the next slide, I'll kind of walk you through it really quickly. Our mission statement is a similar mission statement to many Research One universities, focus on, teaching, research, and service, so we can keep on moving from there. But our plan's 6 foundations, I think, are very important to us. If you look at the 6 foundations you see here on the screen, many times in the past for our institution, on the past for our institution, these plans would have signified their own separate strategic plans, actually. And we did have a strategic plan for diversity. We did have a strategic plan for global engagement. We did have a strategic plan for sustainability. As we went through this most recent process, we wanted to fortify our plans, our current plan, with these 6 foundations, which we do believe are integrated into everything the university does, and they're critical to implementing the plan. These foundations are not specific to certain programs or units, which is very important through the planning process, because you would think fostering and embracing a diverse world will become the ownership of our Office of Educational Equity and Diversity. We really were intentional of saying, no, this has to cut across everything we do. And everything we do must be built upon these foundations, which connect to our values as an institution. I say this a lot, and I've said this to our colleagues, we cannot deliver on these foundations without the involvement of all members of our university, our stakeholders, our staff members, our faculty members, and our students, current and former. And I think that's the key when you think about institutional effectiveness, is that every member of the organization should be and has to be involved in your planning process. If I can go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about our thematic priorities. So the thematic priorities, these are the more outward-facing goals for the institution. These are the areas that, as I've said before, we think will be where we'll have the most impact in the Commonwealth. The foundations kind of support our 5 thematic priorities, which many people like to say this kind of serves as the meat of our strategic plan. I really have to note at this point that our 5 areas of thematic focus are not meant to exclude anything else. This is just what the institution decided were going to be very important areas over the next 10 to 15 years in higher education. So things like transforming education, enhancing health, stewarding our planet's resources, advancing the arts and humanities, and driving digital innovation were so key to what our institution wanted to do as far as our thematic priorities. And finally, I'll just go one more slide, and I want to walk you through the supporting elements. Next slide, please. So one thing that we miss sometimes in this notion of institutional effectiveness, particularly on the planning side, is the inward-facing things that need to happen as an organization. We very much strongly focus on the sexy things like transforming education and enhancing health across the Commonwealth and beyond, but sometimes we also need to focus on our basic organizational processes. We need to focus on our infrastructure and our support, and we also need to focus on constituent outreach and engagement. So these are key areas of our strategic plan. And you know, it just our plan, we know, identifies the important supporting elements in these functional areas that must be in place for us to be able to achieve our foundations and our strategic and our thematic priorities. So that's the key to these. So organizational processes, infrastructure and support, and constituent outreach and engagement are key functional areas for the university to look at closely. And I'll talk to you about, I think on our next slide, yes, if we go to the next slide, I want to show you how this all works together. So here's the implementation structure for our strategic plan. What you see in this graphic, it shows the layered committee structure we built to implement our plan. The oversight committee shown at the top oversees the work of the 8 executive committees and their supporting steering committees. One thing to point out, at one point, we didn't have an oversight committee in this structure. But what we realized as we started talking was that if we didn't have that oversight group, we would basically have 8 separate strategic plans. And one thing about being an effective organization, institutional effectiveness and planning, is that we're interconnected. And so we had to make sure that each of those areas were interconnected. And this work of the oversight committee is to do that. As you can see here, each executive and steering committee aligns with a thematic priority or supporting element. And the foundations shown to the left are integral across the entire thing. So you see how that green line cuts across the entire strategic planning process. You know, this all came from, if you look at that yellow bar at the bottom, we get feedback from the community on all of these topics. So we have regular community forums, town halls, presentations, work with our faculty senate to get feedback in each of these areas. And so that's the community forum. So the loop really is up from the community through our steering committees. The executive committees are charged with making sure resources are in place. And then the steering committee is charged of making, the oversight committee is charged with making sure that those resources are interconnected and that we're working across our strategic plan. Next slide, please. That's a pretty, I will say this, as we go to the next slide, when I rolled out that structure, it was not very well received. That's a pretty busy way of looking at strategic planning. We talk about here, we have at any given time more than 200 plus unique individuals working on strategic plan, and we're 3 years into our planning process. And as I get into the alignment process, I'll kind of explain to you how we've kept people engaged in this plan. Next slide, Chris. Oh, next slide, please. Thank you, sir. Moving forward, our call to action is clear. I really focused with our leadership on, it was tough to develop the plan. It took 2 years to do it, and it was a university-wide effort, but implementing the plan has been very difficult as well, and we needed our leadership to be engaged. So I've met with leaders across the university, all of our deans, all of the chancellors at our campus over the past few months to really talk to them about, here are our expectations. Here's where we expect you to be engaged and be a leader in this process. We've asked them to be engaged. We've asked them to be accountable. We've asked them to communicate with us and be receptive to our feedback. All of our units have to provide an annual update of where they are and how they align with the university plan. And my office gives feedback to each of those units. But we also stress to them, without their leadership, we will not achieve this outcome. And it's been very important, and I think we've had a lot of engagement with our leadership in this area. If you move to the next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. You know, I think one of the keys that when we put this structure together, and we put a lot of structure around implementation, it makes sense because our strategic planning process is not just happening in a vacuum. The overarching strategic plan across 50 academic units and administrative units wrote their plans first, just remember that. This process was essential to ensuring the alignment across all of our campuses, across all of our colleges. We want to make sure as possible that we were all on the same page. And I think that notion of consistency is so important. And we talk about consistency and congruence. You want your plan to be congruent with all of your units. You want all of your units to be able to see themselves in your strategic planning process. I've met with chancellors that'll say, you know, these thematic priorities are pretty awesome, but I really don't see how we can be engaged in this work. So we actually have time where we sit down and talk about how do we align your work with the work of the strategic plan. Next slide, please. When we think about this notion of planning and institutional effectiveness, we talk a lot about why strategic planning is essential for an institution of our size and in any institution. By identifying our goals at a high level through our university plan, we establish a strong foundation for the pursuit and for their pursuit and implementation, and that's what we're really trying to do. We have pivotal pieces in place to extend the university's reach to our plan, and we really do believe that the strategy we lay in place here will lead to execution, which will lead to success. And that is true. If you look at that those 3 words there, that's institutional effectiveness as well. From a planning perspective, you identify the strategy, you execute on that strategy, and then you have success. And that's what you want to see as an effective institution. And we are still focused on exceptional teaching, research, and service as an institution. I'm going to go to the next slide, and this is where I want to talk to you a little bit about how we measure our strategic plan. And I'm going to say something that I usually say, and I look for all the gasp and the shock in the crowd. But our strategic plan, all the work that we put into it, we don't have metrics. There are no metrics for our strategic planning process. And I will say to you, try selling that to your board of trustees that's made up of mainly business leaders from across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The first thing they want to see is, where's our big, hairy, audacious goal? And what we decided as an institution was that if we put a focus on metrics, that's where the focus would be. You know, we have metrics aligned with each of our thematic priorities and each of our structural elements, that the energy of the university will be focused on meeting that metric and not achieving the goal. And so we actually do not have metrics for any aspect of our strategic plan. What we do is we do alignment. And so what we try to do is make sure our strategic planning process is actually aligned with our unit level plans. Thank you. Our unit level plans, our seed grants, and our signature initiatives. Let me walk you through that really quickly. You already know what the unit level plans are. Those are the plans that are coming out of our 24 campuses, 17 colleges, and administrative units across the university. Our funded seed grants is something unique, and I think this is one way where we keep our institution engaged. We actually have a seed grant process where any member of the university community can apply for a $250,000 grant that aligns with one of our thematic priorities or structural elements. And we do that, we actually award 10 of those grants twice a year. We have 2 cycles that award 10 grants per cycle. So the seed grant process has been phenomenal in making sure that members of our university community can think creatively, can think innovatively, can be bold in some of the ideas that they think will help us achieve. To this date, we've funded, I want to say 48 seed grant proposals with an investment of almost $8 million from the university in those proposals. What we're doing with these seed grant proposals is that we hope that by investing in good ideas, interdisciplinary ideas across the university, that those ideas will lead to what we call signature initiatives. Right now, we only have 4 signature initiatives within our strategic plan. And a signature initiative is something that's either bubbled up from a seed grant or across the university people have engaged in, and our provost and president have invested at least $1 million in each of our signature initiatives. So one of our signature initiatives is reimagining our institutional research, our information technology. So reimagining IT is a large undertaking at the university where we're looking at structural and organizational processes around information technology. The second signature initiative is combating a consortium to combat substance abuse across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Again, we're looking at the opioid epidemic as something that's really real. And so as an institution, we've invested in a signature initiative to have a cross-disciplinary consortium to combat substance abuse. We've also invested funds in enhancing the humanities and creating a humanities district at all of our campuses, making all of our campuses focal points for their local communities when it comes to the humanities and the arts. And then there's one more that we really just started looking at, and that's looking at water. So when we think about stewarding our planet's resources, and we've done an international approach to how we look at water and from a resource perspective. So those are the signature initiatives. All of these areas, the unit plans, the seed grants, and the signature initiatives all feed into data about our alignment with our strategic plan and achievement of our plan. As we look at the assessment of our plan, we're actually assessing it not only with quantitative numbers. We know how many people are engaged in each of these. We know, but we're also looking at qualitative data and really trying to tell a clear story for our strategic planning process. As I tie it all together, I think anything about institutional effectiveness is really about how do we make quality decisions. And so from our strategic plan to our creating a strong data infrastructure, what we're trying to do in this world is to have good quality decision making, from our data custodians to the producers of those data to the users. All of that is to say in our decision makers is how do we create a robust environment for clear data decision making and clear institutional effectiveness. Next slide, please. Next slide, Chris. And I've hit the 2:45 mark. I want to make sure I left 10 to 15 minutes for questions, but also I know our colleagues at the Campus Consortium also have some questions as well. These are my Jerry McLaughlin-isms, just some fun thoughts that he likes to put out there. You know, not everything that counts can be counted is one of my favorites, and not everything that can be counted counts. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And change isn't about solving problems, it's about living in a better future. And that's my presentation for today. Thank you everyone for your time. I look forward to your questions and your ideas.
Very good, Lance. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. We are going to take some questions. We've had a couple come in as we've been listening diligently to the conversation today. So I'm going to kick off with one of those questions that came in. Lance, this is from Sharon in Ohio, who asked about additional materials or references or resources and even conferences that you might suggest that would help one with the further study of IE.
Yes, I'm a huge fan of AIR. I think the Association for Institutional Research is leading in this area. So I do think AIR is a great place to go. I think it really depends on how your focus is. Like I talked about before, if you're thinking about planning, I would definitely look at SCUP. I actually think there was a recent publication out from Christina Powers, actually with a focus on institutional effectiveness. So Christina Powers, I think, actually has a publication out now with various perspectives on institutional effectiveness. So that's where I would start with. I think there's some really good resources. Those are some really good resources out there.
Very good. Thank you. And we'll note some of these recordings or these references in a recording that we will be sending to all of our attendees today. So if you didn't catch some of the URLs and or some of the references that Lance is making here, those will be in the slide deck and the recording that we will be sharing with all attendees today. The next question we have is from Jack in New York, who asked about your reference to Penn State systems currently being updated with students and meeting students where they are. Are your systems there, and how did you get there?
They're not there. They're not. And when I arrived 4 years ago, I actually believe Penn State is behind a lot of our peers in this area, and I know this is being recorded. But I do think that's been our catalyst, is that we have not been able to ask tough questions about the overall student experience. And just to put this in perspective, many of your institutions have had ERPs in student finance and HR for 10 years or more. Penn State just moved to their student ERP system in 2017, our HR ERP system in 2018, and we'll have our first finance ERP system in 2020. That's why we are developing this data ecosystem so that we can connect the data for all of those areas so we can start asking those tough questions. So we're not there yet, but if you look at that website, psudata.psu.edu, we've been kind of chronicling our adventure and making this happen. I'll even put it blunter. The president and provost pulled myself and the CIO aside and said, fix the data mess. And that's what we're trying to do.
Well, that's a great lead into our next question, which was about how do you plan to do that? How do you get better access to data and evidence? And even the I guess the other part of the question is, where is the URL that you're suggesting for your strategic plan, which again we will share. But can you address that first question, perhaps?
Definitely. So, the first thing we had to do, so we've had what we call data summits. We've had 2 so far. We've gotten over 300 members of the university community together at each of those summits. The first summit was for us as a university community to acknowledge that there's an issue. I think in some ways people didn't believe that the data issues were as bad as they were. So we actually spent the day with the CIO and myself talking with the university community about, here are the issues that we're having with access to data, with use of data, with interpretation of data. And so we really laid that out. So that was 2017. That was December of 2017. We took the information from that data summit over the course of a year, and we started developing a new process for data governance, a new process for data integration, and a new process for our data ecosystem, which you can see chronicled on that website. Then we came back for Data Summit 2, and we were able to say to the university community, we heard you, here are the changes that we're making, and here's the investment. That's key. Our president, our provost, and our CIO had to have a regular financial investment in fixing this. And so that's really where we're at right now, is we're now doing RFPs to bring in various vendors to start talking about what systems are going to be appropriate. But the first thing we did over that last year was really rethink our business processes and the processes that we know impact our students.
Very good. Okay, thank you, Lance. So our next question is from Leah. Leah is asking about headlines that we see currently in the press often around number of higher ed institutions that are likely or predicted to close in the coming years. What would you say is the role of IE in reversing these predictions?
I think one thing IE can do is help from a data perspective. Is I think we're not using the data appropriately. If you look at that first tenet of IE, is how do we ask the tougher questions? We see the trends. We knew the trends for some of these institutions for years, but we weren't asking the tougher questions about how do we actually reverse those trends. So I think one is using the data and letting the data guide the revised processes. The other is IE is helping us think about how do we tear down these old structures. Many times our institutions that are struggling are also struggling because we're holding on to old structures and we think the issues are students. So if we can ask those tough questions about what needs to be fixed in our structures and have data to support those changes, I think that's going to be the key to institutions being more solvent, to institutions being more robust and supported, is when we can start asking tough questions. I think IE is the key to that, because you're not only asking tough questions, you're providing evidence to answer those questions, and you're pushing the institution to have action in doing something. One thing I talk a lot about is the institutional will to change. We've known, even here at Penn State, we knew our data issues 10 years ago, but there wasn't an institutional will to fix them. Until things got so bad that we couldn't start talking about our student experience in a way that was meaningful, was then we started saying, hey, we gotta make changes. So I think one thing that's important, and we don't really talk about this in IE, is that institutional will and commitment to make the tough changes.
Speaking of change, Lance, our next question is from Sam in California, who's asking about the reference you've made to the number of changes we've seen in higher ed in the last 25 years. He's asking, what do you predict we will see as far as the greatest changes to come in the next 5 years?
You know, I think the one thing I think we're going to see is a rise in online education. I think that's a positive and a negative. I think on the positive side, you see the rise in online education providing more access to education. On the negative side, if institutions don't commit to high quality online education, we're not going to do our constituents a service by providing that access. So I do believe that the rise in online education is real, and it's not just the for-profits either. I think you're seeing institutions like Penn State, Purdue, with their merger and acquisition of Kaplan, creating Purdue Global. I think you're seeing the rise of online education. The other thing that's going to be important in that is the role of our accreditors. While I know the political landscape has changed over the last couple of years with the emphasis on accreditors having more teeth, I don't think that's going to go away. So I think the notion that the role that institutions have, or the responsibility institutions will have to be more accountable to accreditors, is going to increase over the next 5 to 10 years.
Very good. So I'm curious, when you talk about the rise in online learning, are you predicting enrollment increases primarily, and or number of programs at undergraduate level, at graduate level, or are you seeing that across the landscape?
I think it's both. So I'll give you the example here. When we opened Penn State World Campus 15 years to 20, it was 20 years ago, we had 200 students and 5 programs. This year, we're going to graduate 3,000 students, over 150 academic programs. Our Penn State World Campus enrolls 14,000 students. It's actually our second largest campus next to University Park. So I think that's the rapid rise you're going to see, not only in enrollment, but also in the academic offerings as well.
I say, well, thank you, Lance. This was a great presentation. Thank you for the discussion that followed. We really appreciate your time and your insight and sharing that with our many participants on the line today. We do want to quickly just mention a number of the grants that the Campus Consortium offers institutions as well. And these are listed here on this slide. We have a number of them open. A student recruiting grant. We have a grant that is running currently for student information systems, AI for admissions and enrollment. We've got a multi-factor authentication grant that is open, campus safety, and campus portal grant. So we encourage everyone to visit campusconsortium.com and consider applying for one of these grants to help your institution scale some new technologies, and to do so at a savings to your institution. These grants are open until May 20th of this year, and we again encourage you to check them out at campusconsortium.com. Our next Ed Talk coming up for the month of May is going to address cybersecurity and the future of cybersecurity in higher education. So look for an email invite with the details on that Ed Talk. But in the meantime, we do want to thank you all for joining us today. We want to thank once again our presenter, Lance Kennedy-Phillips, for a terrific session and for great insight into the go forward with institutional effectiveness. Lance, thank you again, and thank you all for joining us today. This is John Wanamaker signing off from Ed Talk and the Campus Consortium. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, thanks a lot for everyone. And this is Campus Consortium dialing out. You guys have a fantastic day ahead. Thank you.